my name is Lesley Simanton, and I'm here today to talk about a study that I conducted as a part of my PhD research. You may have seen galaxies like these before. They're called spiral galaxies, and they're just like the Milky Way galaxy that we live in. It's important for us to study these types of galaxies so that we can know more about our own. All galaxies are made up of stars and gas and dust. In those spiral galaxies, you see that as the spiral arm structure. And what's interesting is the stars that are forming in there, they don't form alone, they always form in groups. We call these groups star clusters. They contain hundreds, thousands, even millions of stars, and we see them in every type of galaxy. There are two types of star clusters that we see in the Milky Way. There are globular clusters. They are very large, massive clusters that have hundreds of thousands to millions of stars in them. Their colors are very red because they're old, some of the oldest structures in the universe. And they're usually located in what we call the halo of the Milky Way. It's a spherical distribution. Whereas there's another type of cluster called open clusters that are usually located in the disk. These clusters are much smaller, usually only containing hundreds, thousands of stars, and they're a lot bluer because they're younger. We still see individual stars in galaxies, but these stars didn't form individually. They still formed in clusters. They merely got thrown out as their cluster broke apart. Clusters often break apart from something called two-body interactions, or relaxation. It's when two or sometimes three or even more stars interact gravitationally, and so one star is imparted a lot of velocity, and it gets sort of slingshotted out. However, if a cluster is very massive, very large, it has more gravitational pull towards its center, and it may keep that star bound. Smaller clusters are more likely to lose those stars that are flung out. And so in this way, smaller clusters will break up first before the more massive clusters. It turns out that if you count up all of the star clusters in a galaxy and you rank them by their brightness, you get something called a luminosity function. It follows a power law that rises towards the faint end, so you have a lot of faint clusters. But over time, all of those faint clusters start to break apart through the two-body interactions, and you will end up with an older shaped luminosity function that's peaked or has a turnover. In the study that I conducted with Dr. Rupali Chandar and Dr. Whitmore, we looked at star clusters in the nearby Spiral Galaxy M101. We used Hubble Space Telescope data, which has great resolution, to select star clusters that were old based on their reddish colors. But what was strange was that when we plotted their luminosity function, we found that it continued to rise in a power law like we saw for young clusters. It did, however, have a dip at the center. Also, what looks like a turnover on the faint end is actually just a limitation of how faintly you can observe clusters. The dip can be explained if we think of this as not one population of star clusters, but two. If on the bright end we have an older population that has that turnover, but on the faint end we have a population of clusters that continues to rise as though they have young ages. However, remember, we selected these clusters based on their red colors, which would indicate they should be older. If we plot the Milky Way globular clusters along with the M101 clusters, we see that they match very well on the bright end. The bright clusters also match the sizes and the colors and the spatial distribution of the Milky Way globular clusters. When we look at the positions of the bright clusters, we see that they're very centrally concentrated, and that's what we expect for a spherical distribution. Clusters that are in the halo, like the Milky Way globular clusters also are. They're clearly very similar populations. However, the faint clusters are much more evenly distributed, which indicates that they're associated with the disk of M101. Their sizes are also much larger than the bright clusters, which means that they have a larger volume and that they have a much lower density. This is actually very relevant because a low density means that there's less of those two-body interactions that cause the clusters to break apart. And this means the faint clusters could actually be older ages than their luminosity function makes them appear to have. So the question remains, what are these faint clusters? They have red colors, which we would expect if they were old clusters, but they have a rising luminosity function like we see for young clusters. However, they also have those extended sizes and low densities, which makes it possible for us to have the rising luminosity function and have old ages. They're also associated with the disk of M101. This is very unusual, as typical old globular cluster populations would be associated with the halo. They're actually more similar to the open clusters that we see in the Milky Way. When we look at a type of galaxy called lenticulars, we see that they have disks, but that they are very smooth, much smoother than the spiral arm structure of spiral galaxies. In them, there's been a class of clusters found called faint fuzzies. They are very faint and they are very extended, so they have lower densities that allow them to have a rising luminosity function but still have old ages. They've been confirmed spectroscopically to have ages of 7 to 8 billion years old or older. And we think that they might be very similar to our faint clusters in M101. Faint fuzzies are also associated with the disks of their galaxies. In fact, in a study released last year, they found their motions so associated with the disks that they concluded they were simply old open clusters. And they predicted that we could find similar clusters in spiral galaxy disks. We just needed to look a little bit harder because of that clumpy spiral arm structure. It's much more difficult to pick out faint objects against it than in the smooth disks of lenticular galaxies. We believe we may have found such old open clusters in the disk of M101, and we intend to search for more in other spiral galaxies in the future.